Hello, hello, my Black history lovers. Those of you who enjoy reading about Black history, here is another video that was supposed to be done for you way back in February. And as I explained in the last one, that we were a bit delayed in things going on. And so we did not get our Black stories that we usually do in the month of February, those books that you may want to invest in the libraries of your young people, whether they are your nieces, your nephews, your sons, your daughters, your grandchildren, whomever the young people in your life, the little people may be, investing in their libraries or just simply investing in your own library so that when they come to visit you, that they have books that they can enjoy. And I'm sorry that I am so delayed in getting this to you, but once again, Black history is not relegated to one day or 1 week, month. We know that Black history is 365, 366. It is continuous. And so, because it is, any time is a great time to talk about Black stories. And this time we have probably one of the most noted figures in America's history, as one would when thinking of African Americans or those of the African diaspora. This is probably the most known figure besides Dr. King, and that would be Frederick Douglass. Oftentimes, we see his pictures on the walls during Black History Month, but many of our children know very little about Frederick Douglass because he simply has been, as many of almost all of our sheroes and heroes have become mere fixtures on walls for a few days in a month in their classrooms, if they happen to go to a school that still celebrates and honors the contributions of all Americans and take the time to celebrate those contributions during periods of the year. And so I thought it would be wonderful. This is my probably between Dr. King and Frederick Douglass, two of my historical crushes, I can say that. But we are going to do this book not because he's a crush of my historical crush, but because I believe that he is an important figure that we should talk about. And I was really surprised when I picked up these books at the local library here in the Houston area in Pearland, because it is not in a predominantly Black community, and they had a very large, sizable collection of books for young readers, children and young adults, about our stories. And that is so important in this day that we're living in, where our narratives are being pulled out of the schools and many institutions are being told and demanded by the government, which is crazy because we live in this free society, supposedly, that our stories should be free to be told. But strangely, our government is bent on telling institutions you must eliminate the stories of Black people. And so I think this is all the more reason to grab those books and have the resources in your homes for our young scholars, our young thinkers. It's great to have toys and what have you and the electronics, but every now and then you need to give them hard copies of books that they can have that are tangible for them, because technology is not the best thing for our young people. And whether you're religious or not, I will also say it is good to have a physical copy of a Bible for your young person. But anyway, this is the book that we're going to be reading on today. Frederick Douglass, For the Great Family of Man, by Peter Burchard. Burchard. I don't know if I'm butchering his name or not, but anyway, I think he's responsible. It says author of One Gallant Rush, the inspiration for the Academy Award-winning film Glory. So he has an extensive background in writing historical books and so forth. And so here we are. We're going to just read a small portion of this, and hopefully it will inspire you whether to go and buy a book for yourself. I do have a much larger book that I was going to share on Frederick Douglass, or to invest in either this book or another book for your young readers about Frederick Douglass. And so here we are. We'll begin with chapter 2. Those songs still follow me. Douglass was born in 1818 in the month of February, day unknown. He was part of a large family rooted in the soil, the creeks, the estuaries of the eastern shore of Maryland, a narrow L-shaped strip of land on the peninsula that lies between Delaware Bay and the shallow waters of the Chesapeake. Because he belonged to the long-established Bailey family, and because his father was unknown, he inherited his mother's surname. In the only record of his birth, he is listed as Frederick Augustus, son of Harriet Phoebe, 1818. His mother, whose first name was elsewhere spelled Harriet, Hariet, chose to call her second son Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey. Years later, after he escaped from Maryland, he changed his name to Frederick Douglass. Frederick's maternal grandfather, Isaac Bailey, was a freeman, a sawyer, a craftsman who cut and trimmed hardwood and pine. He sold the products of his hands to carpenters and cabinet makers, so he had money of his own. Frederick's grandmother, called Aunt Betsy, might as well have been born free, so much freedom did she have. But his mother, as the daughter of a woman who was technically a slave, was anything but free. Frederick, who could only speculate about his father, knew his mother only slightly, but would remember her as tall, dark-skinned, and beautiful. She was sedate and dignified. Harriet counted as an asset among mules and oxen, cows and sheep and chickens, and rated as less valuable than a dray horse, bent her back from dawn to dusk to hoe and seed and harvest wheat and to plant and bring in corn. At the same time, she was obliged to give birth to a brood of healthy children, who in time would increase her master's fortune. Most members of the Bailey clan were born near Tuckahoe Creek on Home Hill Farm, which was owned by their master, Aaron Anthony, who, it was rumored, might have been Frederick's father. Slavery, Frederick was to say, does away with fathers, as it does away with families. Frederick was the fourth of 7 children, 2 boys and 5 girls, but his life was so arranged he seldom saw or had a chance to know and love his brothers and sisters. His mother, who was forced to give him up when she finished nursing him, soon became a ghostly, loving presence, then a distant and romantic memory. It was Frederick's happy childhood years and a generous measure of good fortune that sustained him in his years of abject slavery. As a child, Frederick lived with Aunt Bessie, who raised scores of children while their mothers spent their daylight hours working and their nights recuperating from the rigors of their toil. Aunt Betsy was tall and dignified as her daughter Harriet, born 2 years before the signing of Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence, a document that had no immediate effect on the life of any slave. She was in her 40s when her grandson, Frederick, came to live with her. She was a skillful gardener, and a practiced fisherwoman. She knew how to bait a line and take a crab and how to find an oyster bed. Aunt Betsy's modest cabin near the Tuckahoe was sort of a nursery where slave children lived in blissful ignorance of what lay in store for them. There Frederick went barefoot, rinsed his single roughly woven garment in the creek, and dried it in the sun. But soon after it was given to him, it became torn and tattered, and was not to be replaced for many months. None of Aunt Betsy's children starved, but they lived mostly on cornmeal. Now and then, Betsy blessed her favorite grandson with a sweet potato or a morsel of crab meat. His mother must sometimes have watched him from afar, must have taken pleasure in his antics, must have noticed his intelligence developing. But as often as she might have longed to speak to him and nurture him, she found only isolated opportunities to do so. Somehow, Frederick learned that when he was 6 or 7, he would have to leave his grandmother. The fact is, such was my dread of leaving the little cabin, that I wished to remain little forever, for I knew the taller I grew, the shorter my stay. The old cabin, with its rail floors and rail bedstead upstairs, and its clay floor downstairs, and its dirt chimney and windowless sides, and the hole curiously dug in front of the fireplace, beneath which Grandmama placed the sweet potatoes to keep them from the frost, was my home, the only home I ever had, and I loved it. If one thing marked Frederick as an individual, it was his captivity to contemplate the mysteries of his childhood world. Down in a little valley, not far from Grandmammy's cabin, stood Mr. Lee's mill, where the people came often in large numbers to get their corn ground. It was a water mill, and I never shall be able to tell the many things thought and felt while I sat on the bank and watched that mill and the turning of that ponderous wheel. In his grandmother's yard, he discovered that the stars were more than holes in a dark blue sheet of paper. He learned that tender roots stirred underneath the surface of the soil long before the spring rains brought forth grass and vegetables and flowers. With a bent pen, Frederick fished in the mill pond. His was a carefree life. But in all my sports and plays, and in spite of them, there would occasionally come in the painful foreboding that I was not long to remain there, and that I must soon be called away to the home of old master. Although he knew that someday he must leave Home Hill Farm, his grandmother left him unprepared for the journey and the loneliness that would follow it. Now we move forward to chapter 19, In the Presence of an Honest Man. Eager as he was to help shape public policy, Douglass often traveled to his nation's capital. The great black leader's heart may well have skipped a beat or two as his train pulled into Baltimore, where he had lived and suffered prejudice and violence. So widespread was sympathy with the Confederate cause in Baltimore that at the beginning of the war, Union troops coming from triumph passages through Boston and New York had been attacked, and several had been killed. Washington was under almost constant siege following the firing on Fort Sumter. The White House, which had the air of a rundown country mansion, was on what amounted to a swamp, a breeding ground for mosquitoes, some of which were carriers of malaria and a debilitating, often fatal disease. Until the spring of 1862, when slavery was outlawed in the District of Columbia, slaves had been kept in pens and bought and sold in the nation's capital. Douglass' most influential friend in Washington was Senator Charles Sumner, who had always been an unrelenting enemy of slavery. In 1855, before Sumner was attacked by Preston Brooks, Douglass had written to him saying, "I thank God that talents and acquirements so high as yours are devoted to the service of my crushed and bleeding race." In the days when the two men were often seen in each other's company, they must have presented a conspicuous contrast. Douglass was a rugged man. A crease between his nose and forehead gave him an aggressive look. He wore his clothes as well as any man, but there was nothing of the dandy in him. Sumner, on the other hand, gave no sign of ever having labored with his hands. He wore meticulously tailored clothes and bright-colored vests, some of which were covered with embroidered flowers. More importantly than their differences, most of which were superficial, was their absolute agreement on the most important issue of the day. When they talked of slavery, they never had to argue over its morality, but instead discussed their strategies for ending it. For example, in a time when it looked as if the North might lose the war, they had worked almost in tandem to persuade Great Britain not to recognize the Confederate government. By 1863, Sumner had become a friend of Lincoln and had paid frequent visits to the White House. He had sometimes mentioned Douglass to the president, who had listened patiently to the frequent criticisms leveled at him in his paper and his speeches by the great black abolitionist. In fact, Lincoln, never one to hold a grudge or seek revenge, was curious about the younger man. At a time when Douglass was preoccupied with the welfare of black servicemen, he sought an interview with Lincoln so that he could talk with him about the treatment of black prisoners of war, equal opportunity for promotions of black soldiers, and equal pay. He was especially eager to make sure that if black prisoners were hanged, shot down in cold blood, or sent into slavery, the president would retaliate by ordering the execution of a rebel soldier. Douglass was introduced to Lincoln by Senator Pomeroy of Kansas. Not sure if I'm saying his name right. Pomeroy of Kansas. The two men went together to the cluttered room that served as Lincoln's office. Referring to the extraordinary length of Lincoln's legs, Douglass later wrote, "When I entered, he was seated in a low chair, surrounded by a multitude of books and papers, his feet and legs extended in front of his chair. On my approach, he slowly drew his feet in from the different parts of the room into which they had strayed, and he began to rise and continued to rise until he looked down upon me and extended his hand and gave me a welcome. I began, with some hesitation, to tell him who I was and what I had been doing, but he soon stopped me, saying in a sharp, cordial voice, 'You need not tell me who you are, Mr. Douglass.' The two men were not of the same race, but they had much in common. Both had been curious enough in childhood to teach themselves to read and write. Both had been born with a genius for expressing complicated thoughts in simple language. True, both were creatures of their time, and sometimes spoke in ways unfamiliar to us now, but both were capable of transcendent eloquence. Lincoln invited Pomeroy and Douglass to sit down, and Pomeroy was silent while Douglass started to explain the purpose of his visit. Later, he remarked, I at once felt myself in the presence of an honest man, one whom I could love, honor, and trust without reserve or doubt. When Douglas raised the question of retaliation for war crimes, Lincoln reminded him that 2 weeks earlier he had signed an order promising that in response to the killing or enslavement of black soldiers, he would order retaliation upon the enemy's prisoners in our hands. However, paradoxically, Lincoln added that the thought of executing any man for an act committed by another man was revolting to his feelings. The order then became an empty threat, even in the face of the wholesale slaughter of black troops following a battle at Fort Pillow, an outpost on the Mississippi River. Lincoln never could bring himself to order execution of a man who had not stood trial and been proven guilty of a crime. Anyway, so that is our book on Frederick Douglass, a short reading from that book, Frederick Douglass for the Great Family of Man. Consider checking this book out at your local library, see if it's there. If it's not, I'm sure that you could probably request it for your young reader, your young scholar, or maybe it's a book that you want to look into purchasing. And if there is a local Black bookstore in your area, check with them first before ordering from Amazon. I know Amazon may give you a discount, but Black bookstores are very important to us. They are safe spaces for us to read. They ensure that we have a plethora of Black material. They are supporters of Black authors. And not only Black authors, many times they are a place where authors of other ethnicities can also come and share and do readings and so forth. So check with your local Black bookstore to see if they may be able to order this book for you or any other book on Frederick Douglass that you may be interested in for your young reader. And so that is the second installment of our 2026 reading on Black stories. Once again, I do apologize that I am delayed in getting these stories to you, but hey, any time is a great time, and maybe even more so now than in February, because we see so much is going on in our nation at this time, to really just wipe away and erase our stories and our existence. And the justification of others to say, well, why does it matter? It shouldn't matter if it's Black. We're all Americans. No, no, no. Because if you continue to tell stories that are only about one segment of society, it becomes easy for you to forget that people that look like us made any contributions. And so it is very important that we keep our stories in front of us and in front of everyone else, so that the others who would try to dismiss our contributions may remember that no, we are great contributors to this nation, and without us, this nation would not exist. Happy reading. Continue to invest in your young readers and scholars and make sure that they have our stories available to them. Thank you.